Tim and Jim, thank you so much for joining Washington Times Higher Ground. I want to get right into your story, Tim, because it's an incredible story. You were a former government agent and rescued kids all over the world. You know, your story is going to be told in a feature film here, and we'll get into all of that. But how did you get into that space? I mean, this is a very incredible, the work you do is incredible. How did you end up getting into that?
Well, honestly, it was the last thing I wanted to do. I always wanted to be a special agent with the U.S. government since I was a kid, right? And so I studied terrorism and weapons smuggling and drug trafficking. And so I ended up in the position I wanted on the border, southern border, doing that, but only for 6 months until I was called in by my boss. And they said, look, we're starting a new child crimes anti-trafficking unit. We want you to be on it. And I remember my stomach instant punch in the stomach. I don't even know what that is. You know, it's like no one knew what that was at the time. But ultimately I said yes. And then we began. What had happened is some software had been created in the early 2000s that allowed to identify child rape videos online. It was kind of revolutionary in law enforcement. And so that's when I got put on the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. And we began getting the end users, these guys who are looking at child exploitation material. What I didn't expect was, once you see the kids and these, people need to know. People think that this is like 16-year-olds or something, which is also illegal and wrong, but it's 7-year-olds, it's 6-year-olds. That's what we were finding. And I remember looking at those images and videos, and there's a great scene depicted that Jim does masterfully. And it's one of the hardest for me because it's so real. I mean, I've had to look at thousands of hours of this stuff, and you got to type it, you got to give the details, and it's horrifying. But what was more horrifying than that was the question, the pending, always there question: where are those kids? How do I find those kids? And that's kind of opens up to the story of why we had to tell the story of Sound of Freedom, because you can only ask that question so many times before you either drive yourself crazy or quit your job and go answer the question.
Yeah, and I want to talk more about that experience, but you just detailed that so well for people to get a sense of what you went through in that position, what that job was like. The film Sound of Freedom is, very much your story, the work that you have done. And, Jim, you made a decision, obviously, when you heard about this story, when you saw the script, that you were going to dive in and you were going to play Tim in this. What was it that attracted you to the role?
Well, the script was outstanding, written by Alejandro Monteverde and Rob Barr. That's the first thing I look for in the part of I'm looking for something that has a redeemable quality to it. Those are hard to find now, and then it's how much of this is true. So I've worked with many, many agents throughout my career that I still stay in touch with. Many of them have trusted me over the years and have, brought me along in many films that I've done. And then it was, do you know who this guy is? Have you seen this? And he says, yeah, that's true. And it broke my heart that what someone like Tim has to go through, and that so few people want to do it. You'll hear Tim talk about it, that these guys that are dealing with drug enforcement, you've got 5 agents that are to stop drug trafficking, but child trafficking, you only have 1. So looking at these guys, there are so few of them that are willing to stand up against this. And I looked at it and said, I love a battled hero story. And that's what this movie is.
What surprised you the most, Jim, as you were going through preparing for the role, going into what you just described, looking at the different pieces of it? What did you learn that shocked you the most about human trafficking, particularly when it comes to children?
I'm not supposed to say it, but I think if you look at previous interviews, you'll know. Can't believe it. That there's such a narrative out there that they want to control on this. First of all, they don't want you to know that there's a south border open. They wanted you to know that there's trafficking going. And if there's trafficking going on, it's not much. Then guys like Tim, they go after and try to discredit him all the time. People I know that say this and that. Or you have an agent walk up to you and said, "Hi, I'm from the FBI. Tell me about Tim Ballard." And then you go, "Oh, Tim Ballard's a bad guy. I got to stay away from him." I'm used to this. When we did The Passion of the Christ, didn't that movie? That's an anti-Semitic movie, right? Okay. Well, why did hundreds of millions of people go to this film? Jesus is more controversial now than he's ever been. I stood up and it may cost me my reputation, may cost me my jobs that I could have had, and it did, or my life. And my heart went out to Tim because I felt like, by God, I'm going to fight to the death for this. Who wouldn't fight for their children? But the cloudiness of this whole thing of the need to water it down, the need to when this Miss Rojas on April 26th gives sworn testimony, and the 850,000 children disappeared. Why is that not a news story? That's 8 Rose Bowl stadiums plus another 50,000. That's not something that people want to talk about, and the media doesn't go anywhere. But they couldn't, because she had sworn testimony, and you have to submit all the facts. They couldn't say she's been fact-checked because they know they would have come off as liars, so they chose to ignore it. They want to ignore this issue, and I want to put a big light on it. And this is the beginning of the onion. It's just the beginning, talking about the trafficking. It's going to go a lot deeper. But right now, the public is, with the power of this movie, is you walk in, you're sitting there, your heart gets on fire, and all of a sudden you're weeping. And then you start to say, I'm tired of it. And I hope the guys that I know that have given me phenomenal information, that those whistleblowers start coming up, and it's like in the thousands. And then it all starts coming undone. And we can end this.
Tim, hearing that, in your journey, having been somebody who's been on the front lines of this, has there been frustration in terms of people not talking about it enough? I mean, you would think hundreds of thousands of people, and in America, the estimates of hundreds of thousands of people being trafficked, that this would be front page news every day. How do you sort of react to the attention maybe that it doesn't get?
It's highly frustrating, especially when you come off an operation and you see the abuse. And that if people knew it was happening, they would. I think there's enough decent people that they would want it to be headline news. But, I go back in history. There's a 350-year period we call the transatlantic slave trade. Predated even the official founding of our own country. And it took till the late 19th century to actually start making headlines. Like, to actually start doing something. It's the same thing. It's people don't want to look at it. They don't want to engage it. We're too involved in our own lives. There's political interest. The parallels are pretty accurate. There's political interest, monetary interest, that people don't want to end slavery. So it's one of the most frustrating things, and I'm grateful when anyone is willing to let us deep dive into this. And I hope the Sound of Freedom will be something that brings in millions of people to where they then come out and say, "Okay, where are the headlines? We need to see the headlines."
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you talked at the start about having to watch the evidence of this and write reports on it. And you've been doing this for a long time. You now have your own organization. We'll talk about that in a moment. But what toll does that take on you, on a person who steps up to do this? And there are other people who are doing this as well. But you probably more than anyone have done it to an intense level. What is that like to process just as a human being, seeing the horrific over and over again?
It beats you up. It puts a million holes in your brain. It does things to you that if you don't have faith in God and also a good therapist, I mean, you're not going to make it.
Tim's a saint,
and
he's a saint.
Thank you. But
I could.
And then the part that's even more difficult is, well, not more difficult, but added to it is, I believe, and I think you do too, Billy. I've known you for a while, and we believe there's a spiritual warfare, right? There's a part of this that it's a darkness that you sense, you see in the eyes of traffickers, pedophiles, people who are hurting kids. There's a soullessness about it, And that makes me believe, okay, there's a darkness we're fighting here. And so you see that manifest when you come home and you get attacked by the good guys. I'll be honest, it's easier for me to fight the traffickers and the pedophiles, meaning logistically speaking, like to find them, identify them, and go after them. I get that fight. I don't get the good guys coming after me. The media, the people that they just don't want it to be real. I don't know if it's born out of, well, I've never done anything like this, so I don't want anyone else to either. I don't know who's backing it. I know that like Vice magazine did like a series of hit pieces on us. Everything was a lie. There wasn't one thing real. It was all just how they do their thing. And then there'd be a piece coming out right after that about how don't call them pedophiles, call them minor attracted persons. So I get it. I see there's an agenda here going on. And our children here at home, the agenda is focused on them. They're in the crosshairs. Sexualize them. Give them pornography and call it sex education. Allow them to consent to things that not in the history of America would you let them consent to injecting themselves with certain things or making decisions at 13. Well, I know what it's leading to. Now they can consent to having sex with a 50-year-old, or they can identify themselves as a 49-year-old. And there's nothing in this. The pedophiles are sitting back, Billy, and they're watching this. And they're going, wow, this has been our agenda for decades. And now half the country is doing it for us. They're actually sexualizing kids, putting them on a silver platter. And when we come in and say, hey, sweetie, just say you're 50 and it's over. And that's where we're at. So that's what I mean by fighting the good guys. I used to think that I might be out of a job someday because maybe, God willing, we could end this. I'm worried we're going to be out of a job someday because the current wave of this godless leftist kind of movement around children are going to begin to eliminate the laws that we need to protect them. So it won't be illegal anymore to have sex with children. That's the fight I'm more concerned with now than even extracting kids from traffickers in Colombia.
Yeah, and there may be people who are hearing you say this who are like, oh, that would never happen. But I would argue 5-10 years ago, I met you more than 10 years ago, when we were first talking about some of these issues, we never would have guessed that we'd be having a conversation today about some of the things that are happening and that are legal right now, that are being legalized in places like California, right, when it comes to children. So I do think it's very interesting and very tragic to watch where we are marching and where we have gone on all of this. And I want to give you a chance, Tim, to talk about Operation Underground Railroad, because that's your effort, that's your organization, and the work you do. Help people understand what you're doing there now.
So Operation Underground Railroad, I founded that in the wake of the story that you watch on the film Sound of Freedom. And it's a nonprofit organization that is made up of operators, aftercare specialists, and we have worked in over 30 countries, every state in the union, providing the tools to combat this, to empower law enforcement and aftercare. And then of course, Billy, about the Nazarene Fund. I'm the CEO of the Nazarene Fund as well, which is equally important, doing similar work, mostly around persecuted Christians and other religious minorities, Middle East, Africa, and other places around the world. So we're running that on two fronts, and it's the solution that we can provide. But we can, like the original Underground Railroad, right? We can rescue tens and hundreds and even thousands. We've rescued over 7,000 at OUR. The Nazarene Fund, has affected the lives of, I want to say, 50,000 people in different ways. But in the end of the day, if we look at the stats, that's nothing. It's worth it for sure. For one, it's worth it. But if you want to end this, that we can't. We need to follow the history, the precedent that was set when the abolitionists got loud, when Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote her book, when Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass spoke out, and when Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe for the first time in the White House, he said to her in the middle of the Civil War, so you're the little lady that wrote the big book that started this war. He had changed the purpose of the war because of the voices. He made the war about liberating the captive because of the voices, because of the media. And so I look to Jim Caviezel and Alejandro Monteverde and the Sound of Freedom as the modern day iteration of Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. This will be the thing that can lead to the end. I can't do it. The storytellers can do it.
So, final question for you, Jim. You know, everything you just heard there, and you have a history of being obviously in films and shows that have a major impact, that are, redeeming, that leave people with something incredibly powerful. When you look at The Sound of Freedom, what is your hope for the final takeaway for the impact that that film will have?
Well, like the Passion of the Christ, I hope that people have the courage to go see it. Right now, we're up against it. We have a program right now for 2 million trafficked children. We need 2 million tickets sold, but when we're fastly selling out, problem is we're up against a wall. We're outselling Disney's Indiana Jones 3-1, but there's a wall up ahead, and we can see it. We're going to smash right into it because we're going to max out everything. So by people calling in right now, it will increase the rate at which, like on the Passion of the Christ, we were able to get more people to see it because we have more theaters. Right now, you're going to have people showing up and they'll say, sorry, it's sold out. And so they're going to go watch Disney's Indiana Jones instead. So we need that. We need people that's what they can do to help. Second part of this, when you go and see the film, let me focus on this. Yes, there's trafficking and all in that. There's great evil in this, and there's nothing worse and more evil than hurting our children. But in this movie, there's a powerful, powerful hero, and it's Christ, and he comes through this man like David, and think about taking down a Philistine, and that's what this guy did, Tim Ballard. And so I got to play that. He looked to me to do that because he knew I went through it on the Passion. He knew I had to stick by my faith and went through all of that, and he believed in his heart that this is where he had to go. And so I'm telling you that you're going to love the movie. It is taken with a huge, huge heart. Yes, on steroids. It has all of that. And I would say that you're going to walk away and go, boy, I'm weaponized. I now know I'm going to be a good father and a good mother, and I know what to look for, a good niece or nephew when I see these traffickers out there. I'm weaponized now. I'm not afraid. I know what to look for. Putting our head down in the sand is not going to be what's going to solve this whole thing. So that's my 2 bits. And my big thing to a lot of Americans is that our love for God's children has got to be greater than our fear of evil.
Well, I appreciate that. That is a great place to conclude here. The film is The Sound of Freedom. Appreciate both of you taking the time today.